Welcome to This Week in Heresy, Episode 12, The Gotcha Verses, Part 2, with our in-studio guest, Reverend Philip Tanner.
So, setting that aside, let's look at this male prostitute idea. I respectfully suggest that before we condemn, anybody for being a prostitute.
Yeah.
But, we could speak specifically of men. Specifically, let's talk about, gay male prostitutes who, I don't want to rock the boat too much. Well, actually, I do. The vast majority of gay men who prostitute themselves in this country are methamphetamine addicts, and they're doing it for meth money. Any listener that wants to go hire a rent boy, you might want to think about the fact that you're feeding someone's meth habit. And that's all I'll say about that. Yeah. Again, look at my other blog, or my other podcast if it ever gets off the ground, because I'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, vast numbers of people who choose prostitution as a way to generate income do it because they're poor. For those of your listeners who know about the unionization of sex workers in San Francisco, for example,
right,
a lot of it had to do with access to healthcare. Yet again, healthcare is a political issue and a moral issue, folks. But if there are people who have to choose prostitution because it's the only thing they're qualified for and they are too poor to get training for something else, or because they're drug addicts or whatever, isn't that actually the problem, not the prostitution? Because, let's talk about some reality here. One of the strongest injunctions or strongest statements that Jesus makes to his apostles is feed my sheep. And in a society that existed in food scarcity, he probably meant it literally. And, given the fact that for those that follow the lectionary tradition in Christianity, we just read about it last week. The apostles said, but Master, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. How can we feed, side note, what was probably 15,000 people in the miracle of the loaves and the fishes, depending on how you interpret the numbers and the references to gender. And Jesus basically said, morons, I'm in charge. Do what I told you to do.
Right.
And magically, the loaves kept on giving and the fish kept on giving. So if Jesus is literally saying things like feed my sheep and, a lot of supply side economic folk, which is my gentle way of saying conservatives, believe that, Jesus says, because Jesus does say this, the poor you will always have with you, but you won't always have me with you.
Right.
Therefore, essentially the war on poverty is some libtard thing. I just used a word that I would not allow in my own podcast. Well, that's a nice thing, except the rest of Jesus's statement gets to the point that you will always have the poor with you. So your work will never be done alleviating poverty.
Right.
And since I won't always be here because they're going to nail me to a cross, I will send the Holy Spirit. The advocate is a common wording used in translation, the Greek, the paraclete, the paraklesis, to help you. The helper, that's another way that it's translated. What Jesus is saying there is your work will never be done. I'm not going to be around because they're going to nail me to a cross, but don't fret. Don't think that you're not going to have help in the work, because God will help you through the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
In other words, keep feeding my sheep. So why do I bring this up in this context? Well, perhaps just as a supposition or a proposition, if we let ourselves be guided more by those clear instructions repeatedly in the New Testament to alleviate poverty, we would no longer find ourselves in a world where people resort to prostitution essentially without a choice.
Right.
Because they're just Maslow's hierarchy, Abraham Maslow. Oh, there's something for the list of references. In other words, people are choosing, who choose prostitution, that are doing so to pay rent, to get food, to get access to healthcare. I mean, in San Francisco, there are some people before Obamacare. Oh boy, did I just get political. who would choose to go back to prostitution because they could get health care through the prostitutes union.
Right.
I mean, how messed up is that? What does that say about our societal priorities? Now, of course, what do you do about the fact that if we created that society, there would still be people who would like sex enough to want to get paid for it? That is so out of scope for a translation discussion that I'm not even going to go there.
Well, that's a whole nother episode by itself. So
now, just as a little historical footnote that I just love because I'm a linguist, this word malakos, to Latin, people who really know their Latin, it may sound familiar. It may remind you of a word malleus.
Oh, yeah.
Which gives us the English word malleable. We tend to say that means soft. It's a malleable metal. It is soft.
Right.
Actually, what it means is it is capable of being reshaped or forged with a hammer. Malleus means hammer. So what's that about? If we generally presume that when we have a word that we're not really sure what its etymology is in this era, in this stratum of the Greek language family, we look to Latin because of the Greco-Roman connections. So what's that about? Could it be that this is saying something like, do not have sex with males who are malleable? Well, that would actually be an argument for don't screw young boys. Yeah. Unfortunately, we just don't know. It remains a mystery. Yeah. So that's about all we got about that. Yeah.
So what's left?
So now we have the big one.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, which is funny considering how even the little one of Jude, we can get all sorts of meaning out of this. The word is, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly. I can read Greek better than I can say it. Aschima suni. I'm going to pronounce the chi correctly.
Yes.
And the specific place that we're going to look at is Romans chapter 1, verse 27, that stalwart magnum opus of the Epistle Paul.
Goodness, yeah, I've had that one thrown at me a few times.
Oh, yes. It's a fantastic work. Chapter 1, verse 27. The word again is aschima suni, and it's Strong's entry G808. And wait for it. This word only occurs 2 times in the New Testament.
Oh, jeez.
Here in Romans 1:27, and then aschima suni also occurs in Revelation chapter 16, verse 15. Now, this is important because even people who want to translate this as a specifically anti-gay thing generally will admit that the difference of the text in which this appears is such that there's nuanced differences.
Right.
What they appear to most likely share in common or have in common is that it has something to do with shameful behavior. What I find so gotcha about this gotcha verse is that in Revelation 16, verse 15, it is pretty darn clear that it's referring to the shame of being naked, being seen naked, specifically men.
Interesting.
Because, we have things that dangle and jump around, whereas women don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no gender bias in the scripture. I do want to point out that as much as Revelation is positioned to be, the end of everything.
Yeah.
There's a book ending with Genesis that is positioned to be the beginning of everything.
Right.
And we get into this thing where children were ashamed when they saw their father's nakedness.
Right.
So I just think that's funny. But here's one where at first I'm going to again make it sound like I'm throwing a biscuit to the anti-gay Christians. It's actually a brick though. Aschima suni. Okay, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I shouldn't throw a brick at the conservatives. I apologize. So the word aschima suni in Romans 1:27, I believe is explicitly referring to sex between men, adult men, knocking boots. It's not child rape. It's not war rape. It's one Roman man getting it on with another Roman man of similar social standing. I will also, just to really throw a monkey wrench into this, is say the following. We're looking in Romans 1:27. If you back up one verse to Romans 21, chapter 1, verse 26, you will find the only explicit statement anywhere in the Christian New Testament and the Old Testament Hebrew Bible about same-sex behavior between women. Verse 26 clearly states, liberal or conservative interpretation, it's talking about women having sex with other women, giving into carnal lust for other women.
Yeah.
Right after verse 27, we find ourselves chest deep in, wait for it again, folks, a list of vices.
Ah, right.
Now, before we go any further, again, as a linguist, I have to point something out. Romans is a stunningly well-written work of literature. In a good English translation, it sings. But the reason that a good translation makes it sing is because the Greek is just wonderful.
Right.
The Apostle Paul's mastery of the Greek language, if you presume that he wrote it, and pretty much everybody assumes that if he only wrote one epistle, that was the one he wrote.
Right.
Collective hallucination, maybe, who knows, I wasn't there. You know. His mastery of the Hellenistic Greek language is in full flower. And as a linguist, you know, I get really excited for any excuse to read anything out of Romans in the Greek.
Right.
It is considered by many faithful Christians to be the tradition of Paul's magnum opus. And even though I have a personal thing for Paul's epistle to the Galatians, and there's another follow-up episode of this podcast.
Yes.
The Greek Geek speaks about the church in Galatia.
Right.
I will concede that this is Paul's magnum opus. If you're going to learn one book of the Christian New Testament to understand the role of the Apostle Paul in the development of the faith, it should be Romans.
Right.
Footnote, Paul is a central character in the second half of the book of the Acts of the Apostles, but read Romans. It's good.
Yeah.
But here we are in an otherwise masterfully written text. This one word, aschina masuni, stands out. It seems to be clearly saying that homosexuality, you know, this men using other men as sex objects without, you know, the pederastic practice of patriarchy, in other words, screwing young boys, or war rape, this is a more generalized injunction. And this is a curse.
Right.
This whole set of verses from verse 26 to verse 18 to verse 32. Romans chapter 1, verse 18 to Romans chapter 1, verse 32.
Right.
Is God cursing people. He ain't cursing them with flowers and puppies.
Right. Well, yeah, normally that's what happens with a curse.
Right. Exactly. So, you know, to use the vernacular of the day, what up with that? A deeper examination of the entire 15 verses of this wrath and this hot, angry God challenges us to move beyond a simplistic interpretation that this is about gay people.
Right.
Here is my argument. More than any other example that I've talked about today or any topic,
right,
this is a time when it is critically important to read this one word, a schema suni, within the verse containing it and reading that verse within its larger context. This is a 15-verse pericope, which is a nice fancy seminary term for a set of verses. I, as a gay Christian, as a pro-gay Christian, am often accused by conservative Christians of not reading the whole passage. Well, you're just debunking this one word, but you're not recognizing that there's a whole curse going on here. Anti-gay theology still falls apart here, as follows. The Apostle Paul is railing against practices that were common in the pagan temple cults. He does that a lot.
Yeah.
We've spoken about it all day.
Yeah.
In this set of worship forms that he is vociferously critiquing, he's railing against the pagans who worshipped animals as gods, for example. what he is doing here in this 15-verse pericope is delivering an extended, strongly worded rejoinder against groups of people who don't place Yahweh, the one eternal, unchanging God, quote, of the Jews, as the deity, the one in charge. We can have a whole side argument about the fact that the commandment, you know, in Islamic context, we would say there is no God but God.
Right.
In the Jewish context, thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Right.
You can have other gods after me. You didn't say you couldn't do that.
Right.
And the ancient Israelites did. They were henotheistic. Hello. Side note.
Yeah.
The big guy in charge, let's say.
Yeah.
Footnote, he doesn't have gender. But what makes this particular set of verses stand out is that God is taking revenge on these pagans that do these worship that God doesn't like. And that the way that he takes his revenge on them is to curse them with homosexual lust. Okay. Ick. Don't like that.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Let's go there. I'm going to put on my faux conservative hat for a minute and try to follow the logic of this all the way through. If I conclude that that is what this is saying, what I am faced with, again, is that there is a logically simple statement here. They did A, therefore I'm going to do B to them.
Right.
If A, then B.
Right.
Again, the example here. If a person A eschews Yahweh, then B, Yahweh will make that person gay. Gina, are the majority of modern day pagans gay?
No, not that I know of. I mean, there's a significant number of them, but...
Right. More than in the average of society.
More than likely.
But, again, if we are going to use this verse... the conservative hat just turned into dust, by the way.
Right.
It didn't fit anyway. And so, that was good.
Hey.
I'll be here till Thursday, folks. The simple logic here is God made these people do this stuff with each other, you know, and he was so offended that he even made the women do it with other women. Oh my God, eek, ooh. Why is God not doing that still?
That's a good question.
Because let's do a little bit of self-disclosure here, Gina. The Foreign Ministries group, as we constitute it now, is you, me, and Reverend Lee.
Right.
Who is the only one of those three that is not a dual citizen, that only, quote, worships Christ?
That would be you.
Who is the only one in that group who identifies as a gay man?
That would be you.
What the fark?
Yeah, and you haven't been smited as, you know, I mean, I haven't seen lightning come down from the sky and make you go poof.
Yeah, exactly. Now, would a conservative Christian can say, well, that's very convenient logic, but you know what God means. And I'm like, well, actually, I might. And it's not that, folks.
Yeah.
Because I don't go to sex clubs. I don't have orgies. And frankly, it's not really your listeners' business whether I do or not.
Yeah.
But I'm going to self-disclose that I don't sleep around.
Yeah.
Which means that pretty much if I'm single, I'm celibate. Rich men with red hair are encouraged to apply. I have a lot of student loan debt and I need a gender man to pay it off. Anyway, does that make me a prostitute? See earlier rant about poverty. Hello, folks. The logic confirms itself.
Moving swiftly on.
So, you know, let's look at this. Why then am I gay?
That's a good question.
At the time the Apostle Paul lived, at the time that he wrote this, there were no gay people.
Right. You know, that goes back to the, you know, what we think of as gay, homosexual, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Just wasn't how people thought of it then.
Right. So what I want to do here, as we sort of reach the end of this analysis, is turn it back around. We have heard in this discussion about these places in the New Testament, we have heard me drill down into one specific word.
Right.
However, the counterpoint to that is what we are doing right now with the Epistle to the Romans. Reading, first of all, applying the ancient context to the modern context is irresponsible at best.
Yeah.
Because it can create false equivalencies.
Oh, absolutely.
Am I going to say that women were not property back at the writings of the ancient Israelite tribes? No, I'm not going to say that that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
I think it was the case.
Yeah.
Am I going to say that that's the way it should be now?
No.
One, among Christians. I have all sorts of reasons from the New Testament that I will say that that's not true.
Right.
By the way, Mary Magdalene was a preacher, folks.
Right.
She wasn't a whore. She was a preacher. Right. She may also have been a whore, but she was a preacher.
Right.
But am I going to tell today's Jews who recognize this long tradition that goes back to the Torah and now includes the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, that in order to really be faithful to the practice of their religion, they need to reinstitute all 613 of the Levitical commandments and the surrounding social location. In other words, kill all the Canaanites, the Muslims. Did I say that out loud? Don't eat pork, no mixed fibers, and women are the property of men.
Oh, that wouldn't go over well.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to say that.
Right.
So why is it okay for me to create that equivalency? It's a false equivalency, folks.
Right.
Modern homosexuality, in other words, gayness, is new. It transcends a simple definition based on sexual behavior with certain types of genitalia. Mm-hmm. People can choose to agree with me or not, but I and many, many academics, including scientists, believe and have data to suggest that homosexual behavior in all of human and animal history has existed, and that in ancient social contexts, the homosexual behavior that was going on was codified. Anal rape in war, screwing young boys as part of training them in the world. We can talk about Alexander the Great and Hephaestion. You know, what was that all about?
Yeah, and then, you know, prostitution and all that.
And, okay, now I'm really going to rile some more traditional people's feathers. David and Jonathan? Yeah, David and Jonathan. What were they doing? You know, he loved Jonathan more than he loved any woman.
Well, hey.
But then again, women were just property then, so who cares, right?
Right.
Hello.
Figures.
But if we codify homosexuality in this way that allows love, commitment, and does not predicate itself on sexual abuse,
right,
then how could we possibly say that the Apostle Paul was writing about that? It didn't exist back then. So perhaps the bigger way of looking at this, rather than saying you're going to get cursed with lustful desires for the same sex if you don't worship just Christ.
Right.
Maybe what God is actually saying is, as an example from the past, learn from the fact that this was a curse in the past.
Right.
In other words, learn from the past, but don't repeat it. Which, if that sounds familiar to your listeners, that is my theological way of saying those who do not learn from their history are doomed to repeat it.
Right.
Maybe what we could do in some sort of translation here is be real and say, yeah, he was talking about same-sex stuff as a revenge for pagan practices. However, the reason that he was talking about this was that God was so enraged by it because it was diluting the message. We no longer live in a world where one message is only allowed, or only one message is allowed to exist.
Yeah, that's impossible to have now.
Yeah, collectively as a species, we are moving toward what Teilhard de Chardin would say is the omega point, the point where everything coalesces into the great singularity.
Yeah.
By necessity, we will have one voice then, because otherwise we aren't the great singularity.
Yeah.
But we don't know whose voice it's going to be.
Right.
It could be a Christian voice that is filtered through Hinduism, paganism, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism, and Shintoism, and Jainism, and you name itism.
Yeah.
It probably won't be the Apostle Paul's voice. There's a whole bunch of Christians who I just pissed off. But anyway.
Well, you know, I do remind you again that this is This Week in Heresy, so, you know, hey, par for the course.
Yeah, you know, I try to be such a responsible scholar that I already expect to, you know, anger somebody.
Yes.
And, you know, let's close this out by saying that yet again, during the time of these writings as an overall corpus, which is the Latin word for body and is the word that we biblical scholars use to refer to the body of the Bible, the corpus. The Pauline corpus is the body of works attributed to the Apostle Paul, literally or figuratively. The only real sanctioned same-sex behavior were the three things. Anal rape of conquered men by conquering men, which, just as an interesting little aside, was not a Greek invention. Other ancient societies did it. There's some anthropologists that would say that the ancient Israelites probably did it because they weren't really men if they were conquered. Therefore, you weren't violating the Levitical code.
Right.
Anyway, that's like 5 episodes of your podcast.
Oh, right.
Second, the Greco-Roman social relation between grown men and young boys whom they were, you know,
mentoring.
Yeah, educating.
Yeah.
Really, when it comes right down to it, that's all it is.
Yeah.
You know, and then you've got the whole prostitution thing within a quote pagan context.
Yeah.
Again, I won't speak for anybody else, liberal or conservative.
Right.
I'm a gay man. I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian before I am a gay man, I will add. And I have no interest in rape. Not really even as a fantasy. TMI. And I don't like little boys. Right. Could that be any more clear? You know, in the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Isaiah, you know, lots of people love to read Isaiah, both conservatives, liberals, Christians, Jews, even Muslims. There is a very strongly worded statement that inspires many people of faith. And it's about how God is preparing to do a new thing.
Right.
And what I respectfully ask everybody when it comes to interfaith dialogue, changing hearts and minds, is let's let go of this obsession of trying to know God logically. And let's just let God's plan unfold. Yeah. And let's let God show God's love equally and get out of God's way.
Yeah, I agree.
That remains my greatest dream as a Christian, as a human, and as a linguist.
Well, basically, you know, it's religiously, you know, and I've even said this about neo-paganism too, is that religiously we need to grow up. Yep. You know, I kind of consider Christianity in its teens, early 20s. You know, where you're still doing stupid things, but you're not quite as stupid as you were. You know, where neo-paganism's like still in the teenage stage, you know, early teenage stage, where it's still feeling out things. Yeah,
it's a 16-year-old kid with an ancient soul.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, we still have growing up to do and evolution to do. And I think, you know, hanging on to these particular verses is detrimental to the church, because you're clinging to a past that really doesn't relate to our present.
And there's a delicious irony in that, Gina, because my way of speaking back or speaking against that kind of literalism is to be literalist. Right. Which you could say is sinking to the level of the conservative. But what I mean by that, this is one of those things where I'm, quote, fundamentalist. I'm a fundamentalist liberal, but not in a bad way. I choose to believe that it's not in a bad way. Yeah. Jesus said, you know, when someone asked him, Rabbi, Rabboni, teacher, master, what is the way to heaven? You know, how do I keep the laws? What do I do? Jesus, you know, basically said that the two things that matter most are And the way Jesus said it was, essentially put no God before God and love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yeah.
And all of the law and prophets hang upon those two commandments.
Yeah.
And, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Make whatever the laws are in your current context, follow them. But recognize that the two laws that matter are worship God.
Right.
And love your neighbor as thyself.
Right.
In other words, if you're going to have sex with your neighbor, treat them the way you'd want to be treated if someone was having sex with you, which is a rather odd way to reach the end of this episode, but there you go. And what I want your listeners to remember, if nothing else, is something that Pastor Beth mentioned in the episode, in a recent episode, a very recent episode. She alluded to this idea that there are Christian philosophers that speak of the idea that every certain number of centuries, the church has a rebirth, a reawakening, a reformation, a reformation.
Yeah.
And there's more than one author who speaks of this. And she cited an author that I haven't read. The author who I've read that speaks about this is another Anglican, Phyllis Tickle.
Right.
Which, she just has the best last name, Phyllis Tickle.
Yeah.
And she wrote a book whose name escapes me at the moment, but it will be in the reference list for this episode. Great Awakening, something like that. She posits her figure is approximately every 400 to 500 years.
That sounds about right.
And yet what she simply does is say, the last one of these was the Reformation, as in capital T, capital R, Martin Luther, yah, rah, rah, rah.
Right.
1517, all that. You add 400 to 500 years to that, and where do you get? Here.
Yeah.
So,
and we're seeing it. It's obvious.
I
mean, there's a decline in traditional Christian churches.
Yeah.
And it's not going up.
Yeah.
Anywhere.
As our beloved Bishop Flunder says, church as usual doesn't work.
Right. And the ones that are being sustained and are surviving are the unusual churches, the church like City Refuge or other types of those churches where very inclusive, a theology that uplifts people instead of condemns at people, and it seems pretty obvious to me, but
and I will actually problematize. We're back to that word. I problematize that. I actually do not fully agree with you. And what I mean by that is we in the liberal bubble need to see it that way because it inspires our work. I'm all for that. And we're not wrong.
Yeah.
But there are parts of, and I'm going to use a word that we're not supposed to use, Christendom, the kingdom of Christianity, that are growing that are not theologically progressive. The Mormon Church, certain parts of Pentecostal churches,
right?
The extraordinarily painful schism in the Anglican Communion, where you've got the provinces of Nigeria and Uganda, and in our own United States, what has happened. And, you want to talk about a confluence of racism and homophobia, is that there are conservative Anglican congregations, the San Joaquin Diocese, to which Pastor Beth alluded, is now two dioceses that are, it's a geographical area code overlay, in a sense. And one of them is now the San Joaquin Diocese of the Episcopal Church in the United States and is relatively more liberal than it used to be.
Yeah.
An entire group of churches from that diocese seceded from the diocese and said, the very fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury, for those that don't know, that's our Pope. The Pope is the Archbishop of Rome to the Catholics. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the highest living person in charge of the Anglican Communion. The very fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury would be willing to have dialogue about homosexuality was so offensive to the most theologically conservative elements of the San Joaquin diocese that they seceded and took it a step further, got with an extremely conservative diocese in Georgia. And I'm blanking on the third state. I want to say Florida.
Right.
I have people from Florida in my family tree. I love them. To create a new Anglican denomination, and they call it the Anglican Church in North America, ACNA, I think is what it's called. And they very explicitly state that they are not a member of the Worldwide Anglican Communion because it is too conservative. In other words, or too liberal. In other words, their doctrine says that the Ugandan legal state about homosexuality is not strong enough.
Wow.
Now,
but is that perception though? That
we don't know.
Like, how fast are these growing? Because it may be in the U.S. that it attracts people.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. being the U.S. and that's another discussion for another time.
We are our own planet.
Yeah. But, when I talk to, like my wife or other people from other parts of the world, they're, a tiny minority, unfortunately, with money and power.
And weapons.
Yeah.
And you bring up a disturbing irony there. Let us use the example of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the occupied territories of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, in comparison to the United States. There is no establishment clause in British law.
No.
In fact, technically, the Church of England is in charge of the country, still to this day.
Technically, yes.
Technically. Ceremonially, the Queen is still in charge.
Yeah.
The United States has an establishment clause. And yet, the way issues of human rights are governed in the United Kingdom and its occupied territories is much more rigidly separated, church and state, than we do it here.
Oh, absolutely.
So, someone's a hypocrite.
Yeah.
And I love to rail on hypocrisy. My Southern accent came back just like that.
Right.
And maybe we're both hypocrites in different ways. But this carries the validity of your point. We need to grow the hell up.
Absolutely.
We need to understand what Jesus meant when he said, feed my sheep. He meant it literally, folks. Feed the poor. Feed those who are starving. Work for a cure to Ebola. Yeah. Spend some R&D money on a new generation of medications that can quell malaria rather than making a more efficient erectile dysfunction drug because it makes you more money.
Yeah.
We live in a society that is so messed up about size and fat, and yet eating disorders are unknown in societies that have an abundance of food and that do not fat shame.
Right.
Eating disorders are also unknown in societies that live in food scarcity that don't fat shame.
Right.
In other words, we have more food than we know what to do with. We pay farmers not to grow food in this country. Yeah. And we shame people for not fitting a certain thing that you can only fit by starving yourself.
Right.
And then we consider it unacceptable to send all of the extra food we could grow if we paid the farmers to grow to people who are actually starving to death. This makes no sense.
Yeah. And that's in country and out.
Absolutely.
Because Detroit, hello.
Let's talk about seminary students that don't qualify for food stamps because under the law we can't. And okay, I'm going to get on my soapbox. Let's talk about those 5,000 military families who lost food stamps because of the compromise that the liberals made with the GOP to get the government running again. Yeah. That was Paul Ryan. I blame him for that. And any conservative that says that they are a patriot, I want you to explain why it was your patriotic duty to take food out of the mouths of active military families.
Well, that goes right back to these verses. Because, they'll be perfectly happy to spout these verses. And yet they're not feeding the poor, which is one of the biggest things that Jesus said for us to do.
Absolutely. Jesus also spoke of self-control and responsibility. And that is a very that is a very common go-to place in these debates with conservative Christians.
Right.
You know, well, Jesus wasn't a socialist. He expected everyone to take care of themselves. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Back the boat up.
Back yourself up for a minute here. There are several, not many, but several places in the New Testament where you can make that argument, and you would be absolutely right. However, Jesus did not say, do this so that you don't have to feed my sheep.
Right.
What Jesus is logically implying, I would argue, in my biased interpretation that I am willing to admit to, is you need to be strong and take care of yourself so that you are more capable of carrying out the mission of feeding the poor.
Well, taking care of others in general. Yeah.
The tired, the poor, the masses.
Yeah.
You know, and don't even get me started on immigration. Get me started on that.
Yeah. Well, I know we could analyze this a little more, and but we are out of time.
And then some, I bet.
And then some, yes. Well, this has been a very good study of these, and I'm sure a lot of people are really gonna like it. I have a friend of mine in New York actually who really enjoys hearing you.
Well, and so, I heard a little crow. People who know Gina well will know exactly what that inside joke was. A little birdie, a little crow told me that the listener numbers for me are good.
Yes, yes.
I mean, I think they're all good.
Well, we have some pretty good listener numbers. Yeah. So, you know, that just reminds everybody to go to the website and subscribe. And
throw a tip in the tip jar. Why not,
throw a tip
folks?
in the tip jar. It's all good. And if you want more information about Philip, if you go to the regulars page, there's a bio and links to his blogs, and we'll have links to the books and stuff, and links to the verses and the Strong's Concordance as well.
We can do that.
Awesome.
Because yes, that is something that I did not specifically mention. This kind of work is so much easier now because of the internet.
Oh, hallelujah! I know.
You know, I'm a seminary geek. I have a Strong's Concordance. It's bigger than yours. I will also add.
I have the little one.
I have the ridiculous one because my vision, I don't see as well as I used to, and I didn't want to use a magnifying glass because that's too nerdy even for me. But the fact that you can look this stuff up online.
Oh, it's beautiful.
I actually mean, I say that takes our responsibility even further, because if the information is that readily available at no cost, there is no excuse for this kind of biblical illiteracy.
Absolutely.
There is no excuse. And I am happy. I believe that ministers are teachers, so I am happy to teach people how to do this work. That's why I posted that blog entry about how to do a word study on the Greek Geek blog. But franchising is where the long-term profits are. Yeah. So take what you are learning here, folks, and go forth and speak it. Don't just listen to it. Do something with it. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying pick a fight at family Thanksgiving. Although,
unless you're feeling ornery, I mean,
could be good. The Christians and the Pagans, the Dar Williams song, Yeah.
Well, sometimes sometimes I know I feel ornery, and
exactly.
Might as well go there.
And be aware that if you choose to do that, somebody might kick you under the table to shut you up. That happened to me. To keep me from going there because we knew it was just going to torpedo the dinner. And recognize that we are more than the sum of our parts. One of the greatest challenges that we face on the left side of the spectrum, let's say, is, well, and I know you will be speaking about this at some point. Right. We are so good at eating our own.
Yeah, I have talked about that before. We talked about it with Devin, actually.
Yeah, we make the GOP's job easy.
Absolutely.
The question is not, can we win elections? The question is, how well can we lose them? Yeah. But even beyond that, we siloize ourselves. We exist in a bubble within a bubble. And we do this, out of a desire to not co-opt someone's narrative. I am not a black man, therefore it is not my place to speak for the black man. Okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah. But that does not excuse you from being a person who is called to liberate humankind in all of its forms, which means that you stand with the black man. You don't speak for the black man, you speak with the black man. Yeah. And you use your privilege to help the black man speak. I am a white man. That gives me privilege and access to academia that I might not have had as a poor person of color. Right. But you better believe that as much as I rail against anti-gay theology, I am more than happy to rant against racist theology. You know, a certain large denomination that shall remain nameless that's based in Utah had a prohibition against African Americans in the priesthood until 1978, I believe it was.
Something like that, yeah.
And it all goes back to a particular way of reading a particular set of verses in Genesis about cursing of different parts of the family, and this myth that exists in other cultures that those people got darker skin. Therefore, they inherit the curse. Bunch of hooey.
Right.
Anyway, but I'll let us wrap up.
Yeah, we'll wrap up. So, like I said, you know, check out Philip's bio on the regulars page, and
if there's specific words that people who read the Bible in, and it doesn't have to be English, because I can read the Bible in several other non-English languages besides Greek. If there are any specific translation points that people who are reading either Testament, actually, because I do want to get into talking about the Septuagint and the role of the Greek with the Old Testament, even though it was written in Hebrew.
Right.
I encourage listeners who are inspired that way or encouraged that way to contact us and to say, hey, you know what? I really like, or I really hated what you did with that.
Right.
And I want to see what you do with this word here.
Yeah. And you can do that either through the comments on the blog with the show on the show notes, or now we have forums.
Yay,
so
forums.
Hopefully you'll be on the forums shortly.
And if we feel a trend, if we see a trend of getting multiple requests, or if a particular discussion thread, you know, goes viral, I think I would interpret that as a call to do an episode on it. But again, it's your podcast.
We'll see how it goes, and you know, and we'll be doing more of these kind of episodes in the future. So different topics. And so like I said, blog posts, you can post in the comments or on the forums, or go to his websites and you'll find contact information there. So thank you very much, Philip.
Always a pleasure.
I'd like to thank Philip again for joining us. And as always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. There you can also subscribe to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, join our forums, or follow us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.